Um, good afternoon. It is afternoon to everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Our webinar, our enrichment webinar from CalBG. And I know we'll probably have volunteers, and I hope we have people who are even not volunteers today. So I'm Yvonne Wilson. I'm the chair of the Enrichment Committee, and I'm going to introduce Peggy Perry. Before I do that, I want to remind everybody that we will take questions at the end. And put your questions into where it's down. If you scroll down to the bottom of your screen, or you run your cursor in that over that screen, it says Q&A. There's the choices, chat or Q&A, and we prefer that you use Q&A. Danielle tells me it's a little easier to moderate. Okay, so let's go right ahead, because I know Peg has a lot of stuff of information to tell us, and I can't wait to hear more about Southern California history. The theme of, or the title of her talk is Dames in the Garden. And I've gotten to know Peggy through working on the Susanna Bixby Bryant Legacy Project. Her talk is an expansion of the talk that both John and I and she gave to the original class that's dealing with the design of the garden. So we covered Susanna Bixby Bryant, and she covered the environment, the historical background, and she covered quite a few women during that time in Southern California horticulture. Okay, Peg has been a member of the Board of Trustees for up to 7 years. So she's had a lot of input into the garden. And she is Professor Emeritus from Cal Poly Pomona University. And she's taught classes on California native plants and in the history of garden art. So I think she has a fantastic background for this particular subject. So Peggy, we look forward to hearing everything.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. And I look forward to sharing the information I've been gathering. This is a research and writing project I've been doing for several years now, and really inspiring to find out more and more about women's roles in California history, particularly as it relates to the landscape. And so I look forward to sharing. I do have a PowerPoint that I'm going to use, and I want to be sure that everyone can see that. So I'm assuming you'll let me know if you can't. So yes, as Yvonne said, I've taught California native plants, and I started bringing students to our garden in 1975. So I've been around the garden quite a long time, and it's a real treat to get to know more of the many people involved, and including the volunteers. So this is sort of a treat to be able to be here with you today. So let's start with a little bit of history, just to put it in context. As many of you know, I'm sure in your own study and reading, originally California was considered by European explorers as a mystical place in the minds of map makers and explorers. And when the first white visitors arrived, they soon saw what it really was in existence, and appreciated the wealth that this new land offered. Here's a different picture of California's map that shows all the richness, much of it plant-based. And so they early on realized what was here, and after more study, the rich botanical resources of the region and the hospitable climate were very much appreciated and attracted nearly as much attention as the more lucrative treasure that they found here. And I'm sure you also know, California is the most biologically diverse state in the United States due to its range of topography and latitude. It's an over 800-mile long state with a coastline of over 300 miles, mountain ranges, the Central Valley, the position on the continent with the Pacific Ocean to the west and a continental landmass to the east puts it in a position of the Mediterranean climate zone. And as a result of all of this diversity, nearly 6,000 species of vascular plants are native to California. 30% of those are endemic, meaning that they don't exist anywhere else. So it was quickly understood by those who were aware of these things that California was a very unique place in this respect. And it is considered a biological, a biodiversity hotspot by conservationists because of the many unique species that are found here, not only plants, but animals as well. So through its history, California has been, the landscape has been shaped by many different contributors. First of all, of course, were the Native Americans who lived here. And while the indigenous people of California were not known to be farmers in the way that the Southwestern Indians were, they were very much active in managing the land. And this more recent book than some of the earlier research by Dr. Kat Anderson really goes into depth about the way that the Native Americans use things like diverting streams, burning undergrowth, replanting corms and bulbs and things of that nature, really did change the landscape. And in this book, she maintains that the foothill woodland and coastal prairies were very much influenced and sort of maintained and enriched by Native American activity. And I'm sure women were very much a part of that because for gathering foodstuffs, they were pretty much the main people within their tribes that would do this. Men were more involved in hunting and things of that nature. So while we don't have any individual records, we can pretty much assume women were involved here. Of course, the mission system brought food plants from Europe and Latin America and introduced non-native animals for grazing. And following that, the Rancho period that we see depicted here had a devastating impact on the native grasslands of California with the importation of weed seeds that outcompeted our native bunch grasses. The role of women here is also not very documented, although I have a few things I want to track down once the libraries are open again. But women did bring a lot of knowledge of plants and their medicinal and other qualities, and these were grown for household uses. The open patio style of architecture was very much present. Unfortunately, very, very few, of any of those gardens persisted into modern history. But a lot of individual work with interviewing people who lived during the last century and even the century before that. We've gotten some picture of women's knowledge anyway, in spite of the fact that their imprint has pretty much been erased. Then, of course, with the Americans coming and people from all over the world coming to California to begin to extract its riches, we had some very serious impact on the landscape. And here we see gold mining. And so we began to notice that people were aware of this destruction. And even in these early days of the mid 1800s, people were beginning to talk about our native landscape and how it needed to be protected. And actually the first nursery recorded in California was in Sacramento in about 1853. So very early on, people appreciated the horticultural potentiality and also the natural landscape that needed protection. So I became attracted to these women who were involved. Here's just a group of women from around 1900. Each of these women that I'll profile in their own way impacted the landscape, some to take advantage of the growth and development occurring in the cities and towns. Others acted to preserve the treasures they saw that were threatened by destruction. Some of these women were educated or began their careers outside of California. Others were native daughters. but their collective creative influence is not necessarily well known. There are a few individuals, but not a collective group. Most of the women that I profile were active in the period in the 100-year span of 1880 to 1980. Not only are their stories set in a time when women were not encouraged to have lives of their own beyond child rearing and homemaking, but their lives were lived in the midst of what else was going on in society, whether it was the women's suffrage movement or evolving expectations in the biological sciences. And one of my favorite things is to try to mine out the kind of little personal characteristics of these women, sometimes what they said or what people said about them. So I'll share some of those as well. So of course, the first person I always start with is Susanna Bixby Bryant, who is a bit of the inspiration for some of my thinking on this. And we all know the story of Susanna. I won't spend too much time because I know Yvonne and John shared quite a bit. And Yvonne's work being so in-depth, looking at the archives we have here in our library that I've also looked at, but Yvonne really picked out all of the specifics. So I'm really grateful for a lot of her work that has helped me understand Susanna and her motivations for doing what she did. And here we have, of course, the garden as it developed there in the Santa Ana Canyon region. And we already know that she was influenced by Theodore Payne and others who were very much exploring the value of California native plants and wildflowers and wanting to make places for people to appreciate them and study them. And today, of course, we have the legacy of her garden. And so that definitely is an inspirational place to jump off from. So I was telling someone once about Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden, and they said to me, well, you know, the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden was founded by a woman too. And I said, oh, really? I didn't know that. And so I had to go do some research. And there is a wonderful history written about the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden by a woman named Mary Carroll, and it later appeared in a publication from the garden. So we're grateful for the work that she did. Some of the facts are a little bit obscured, and so she'll have one version, and then she'll say, of course, other people said it was this way. But there is no argument that Anna Dorinda Blakesley Barnes Bliss, who was a wealthy woman who came to Santa Barbara, as so many other Easterners did, during the early part of the last century, and began to appreciate it for its wonderful climate and situation, and wanting to bolster the artistic and cultural life of Santa Barbara. And so she was already living there, and the Museum of Natural History in Santa Barbara, which still exists, was a place where many of these people came together to talk about how can we improve the life of Santa Barbara. And the idea of a botanic garden came up pretty early on. And ultimately, she was the one who purchased land in Mission Canyon, about 15 acres of land, and donated it to the Museum of Natural History because it was able to accept that gift. The entity of the garden didn't exist yet. And so out of her initial gift of land, and then later a large bequest, $120,000 back in the 1930s, this became the start of the garden. So in a way it was started by a woman. There is some discussion as to whose idea it was that came to this woman with means. And I love this little fact. Her money, her wealth came from her father and family, and it came from a company that had a product named Fletcher's Castoria. Does anybody remember that? My grandmother talked about Fletcher's Castoria. It was a laxative. And if my grandmother is any indication, during the early part of the 20th century, there was a lot of interest in bodily functions for health. And so this was a very successful product. So that's where the money came from. She gave the money and wanted the garden to be in the memory of her father. So there's another little similarity. Henry Blakesley, who she said was a lover of nature. And so initially the garden was called the Blakesley Botanic Garden. So that's an interesting thing. Some people told Susanna, well, you should name it after your father, but she didn't want to do that. So that's interesting. So much of the documentation points to a man named Frederick Clements, who came to Santa Barbara with a vision of a botanic garden. And he wanted to take advantage of this site. There was actually a very grandiose scheme of a series of West Coast botanic gardens all up the coast, up to British Columbia and down to the Mexican border, with the Santa Barbara site being sort of the central hive, but these gardens would profile the plants in each of their locations. Well, that didn't happen, but it was quite a scheme. And the other interesting point is that Mr. Clements' wife, Edith, was the first woman to receive a PhD in botany at the University of Nebraska. So she sort of gave up her own career potential and became his illustrator and editor and assistant. And so there was a woman involved, but she sort of took that backseat approach. Other accounts, however, of people from the time or since then say that actually a Dr. Elmer Bissell, a biologist, and who became the garden's first director, that it was really his vision. And he and his wife and Mrs. Bliss and her husband were having a picnic up in Mission Canyon, and they said, isn't this a perfect place for a garden? So who knows? There's different versions of what happened, but the garden was established and it did begin its development in its current location. Well, another woman came into the picture as Mrs. Bliss passed away, and this is her daughter, Mildred Barnes Bliss, who recognized that part of her legacy would be to carry on some of her mother's wishes. And so with her fortune that she inherited and her husband, Robert Woods Bliss, who was actually her stepbrother, and he was a diplomat, they joined their wealth together and lived a life of diplomatic service. And together they purchased a house or a property called Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. And so they had an East Coast presence, but she knew that her legacy at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden was always calling. So she became involved. She joined the Board of Trustees, and she continues financial support for various projects. Well, the interesting connection, and the reason I bring up Dumbarton Oaks, is because she and her husband bought this estate and remodeled it, and their vision was to have an incredible set of gardens surrounding it. And they contracted with a woman named Beatrix Ferand, who was among the first professional landscape architects in the United States. In fact, she was part of the group of 9 people, the only woman, who organized the American Society of Landscape Architects. And so she became lifelong friends with the younger Mrs. Barnes Bliss. And because the way that Beatrix works on her landscapes was a lifelong commitment. She worked on Dumbarton Oaks for her whole life. And we're going to talk a little bit more about her later. But Mildred brought her to the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden and asked her to be involved with redesigning and developing some areas of the garden that hadn't been seen. Some of the bridges and stuff like that. Well, it was an awkward situation because the Board of Trustees had already engaged a landscape architect by the name of Lockwood DeForest, who is very big in Santa Barbara and Montecito history, to come and work on the design for the garden. And then your big deep pockets donor trustee shows up and said, oh, I brought someone else. And so there was a bit of friction trying to figure out who was going to do what, but they apparently were both professionals and they worked it out. Ultimately, Beatrix Ferand did become part of the board of advisors. So she didn't initially, but later became part of that. They differed on their ideas, and an interesting story about the entrance to the Botanic Garden, if you are familiar with it, it's kind of an odd entrance. You know, you park in a long, skinny parking lot, and then you go up some steps, and the garden doesn't initially make itself known to you. You sort of find your way in. And that was the Lockwood to Forest idea. Beatrix had in mind a much more grandiose entrance. She was very big on the moment of the space, and well, she didn't win out. So we have the entrance we still have today. By this time, the director of the garden was a man named Monsell von Rensselaer. So Rensselaer is a name we hear in other contexts. And so he and Beatrix would work together on things. And I found this really interesting little exchange that I thought you might get a kick out of. Mr. Van Rensselaer wrote to Beatrix Ferand. He said, we had a nice visit recently from Mrs. Susanna Bixby Bryant. This was in 1942, who was delighted with the new library, and I think rather envious. She asked about you, and I told her the plan was yours. And then Beatrix wrote back and said, both Mr. Ferand, and that's her husband, who was the director of the Huntington Library at that time, that's why they came to California, Mr. Ferand and I giggled audibly when we heard Mrs. Bryant had been at the garden. And I think she is probably realizing that the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden is really on the map and is doing good work. So that makes me chuckle. You can imagine there was a little, you know, what are they doing up there anyway? You know, we're the native Botanic Garden. What's with those people up the coast? But, you know, they both kind of came to fruition during the same period. So that's quite interesting to think about, that they interacted. So I think that's just an interesting little anecdote about our sister garden up the coast. So now I'll move on to some other women, and I've organized them in various groupings depending on their action. The first area is the nursery industry, and the first woman, there's a woman named Kate Sessions, who was born in San Francisco, grew up in the Oakland Hills, riding her pony all over the hills. Can you imagine how beautiful that must have been back in around 1860? It gave her a lifelong love of gardens and nature. And when she graduated from high school, she took a trip to the Sandwich Islands, which Hawaii was called in those days, fell in love with bougainvillea and poinsettia and hibiscus, which remained some of her favorite flowers for her whole life. She went to UC Berkeley, studied chemistry, took some agriculture courses, and her first job was as a school teacher in San Diego, which was a pretty dusty place in those days. But Kate and her students planted trees and shrubs around the school, and through friends, she got involved with a nursery in town, and ultimately was offered a partnership, and she never looked back. She became a businesswoman in San Diego. And she grew her nursery business into things that included floral design and landscape installation. She was a sought-after speaker and writer. She collected plants and seeds from around the country and the world. The U.S. Office of Patent Introductions would send her seeds and ask her to grow them in San Diego and report how they did. When Coronado Island was being developed, she set up a nursery there and was very involved in landscaping the Hotel Coronado. And through this time, she became very civically involved, and she became aware of 1,400 acres that had been set aside in the middle of town for a city park. And she approached the city council to ask if she could lease a few acres to start a nursery and a botanic garden. And they agreed if she planted 100 trees each year and cared for them in the parkland. as well as provide 100 trees each year for use throughout the city. And so she agreed, and she went to work and is credited with introducing a number of species, including jacarandas, to San Diego. What would San Diego be without jacaranda trees, right? Her vision was, though, that this become an incredible botanical paradise. And so as the 1915 recognition of the completion of the Panama Canal, or the opening of it, came about with a Panama, California exposition, one in San Diego, one in San Francisco. She saw the chance for it to take place in this area that ultimately, of course, became Balboa Park. And some of the installations from the 1950 exposition are still there, as you probably know. In terms of her well into older age, she had a nursery that still continues up in Mission Hills in San Diego. And she had several residences that still exist with some of the plants that she planted. She never married. She was known to speak her mind and was strong-willed when carrying out her business. She was very hands-on. She would go around your property, and she had a planting crew, and she would she wore these big boots. You can see them in this picture. And she would just dig her heel into places and say, plant it there, plant it there, plant it there. Very no nonsense. She was accused of swearing at her workers, but she maintained she was just yelling Latin botanical names at them. As her hearing diminished, however, her neighbors confirmed her colorful language. She dressed for work. This is an interesting theme. You know, these women were at a time when there weren't dungarees and work boots and things like that. She wore men's shoes. She had a long skirt, and she fashioned inside pockets for her pruning shears and wire and seeds. She wore a man's felt hat to protect her face. She was a supporter of the right for women to vote and encouraged her friends to vote in municipal elections, particularly for beautification in the city. She was frugal and exacting and worked hard her entire life. And she was honored in many ways throughout San Diego, and also got a distinguished medal for her work from the American Genetic Association in 1939. And she went to the ceremony. She said, afterwards, she said, "My bad ears would not allow me to hear anything that was said, but I hope they were talking about the flowers and not about me." Another woman of this era, Theodosia Burr Shepherd, was known as the flower wizard of California. She was a self-taught plant breeder in Ventura, and she started a seed and bulb business in 1902 from her home. Some called her the female Luther Burbank, and in fact, she did travel to visit Luther Burbank and spend some time with him to see what he was doing. She was born and raised in Iowa by a father she adored. Her mother died when she was very young, and she was raised by some very severe grandparents. And so she was looking to get out of town, and she married at 21 to a man who had big ideas and was a free thinker, and she joined him in his beliefs. And for her, the rejection of hell and damnation in her religious upbringing was a tremendous relief, and it sort of invigorated her. Their economic situation was never really healthy. They ultimately moved to California to look for some opportunities, but also because her health was always very fragile. So first they came to the San Francisco Bay Area, but they ultimately came down to San Diego, and her husband bought a newspaper and was an attorney, but he really liked to go around and talk and mix with people. He wasn't the provider that she and her 3 children needed. So she began by making dried arrangements and collecting things from nature around Ventura, which was a very dry, dusty place in those days, and began to sell them in magazines to people around the country. And she did this just so she had sort of what could be called pin money to be able to buy things for her kids, shoes and hats and things like that. But she also began to grow flowers from seed and loved to experiment with breeding. And it was a rather simple practice at that point, just sort of using a little paintbrush type thing and taking pollen from one and putting it on another flower. The worst part for her was getting water. She had to bring it in barrels initially until the city finally did put in a water system. But she did grow her business. She had several catalogs that we can see here, and she became quite successful in the late 1800s. And she began sending her seeds and bulbs all over the U.S., even to wholesale flower seed companies. So she found buyers of her product in bulk. And she began to be recognized more widely. She wrote and spoke in a very accessible style. She promoted the notion of women starting up their own small seed businesses as a way to gain independence and build their self-confidence. And yet at the time in England, there were several horticultural colleges for women. She said, why don't we have them here? And she was also a feminist. She followed the Victorian dress reform movement, which again is about this difficulty in doing real work with these corsets. And here's a picture of her in the middle. She was known for her begonias and her petunias and things of that nature. But you can imagine doing this work in the very constrictive clothing. So this Victorian dress reform was a movement to get rid of corsets, suspend skirts from the shoulders instead, and things that could not make it so your movement was not impeded. And making a fashion garment that was called the Liberty bodice. So that sort of freed up your ribs so that you could breathe and move around. So she was part of that movement, and she would host many women suffragists and others at her home for talks and things like that. She was a remarkable woman. She was full of enthusiasm, was generous, emotional, fragile. She wasn't a really good businesswoman. She didn't control costs very well, but she really did live an incredible life for her time. And here are some double petunias. I don't know if they're associated with her, but this is the bigger picture here is in Ventura behind the public library. And this is the location of her home and nursery. And now it's a community garden. So I imagine some of these tall palm trees were there when she was there as well. Let's see, do I see any questions? Should I stop for that, or should I just keep barreling through?
We don't have any questions yet, Peggy. I think we can keep going.
I saw the little thing blink up. I didn't know what it was. Okay, moving on to the world of botany. Recognizing that botany was really more of a horticultural botany as it emerged in the 1800s, early 1900s. It was about the 1920s when it became much more laboratory based and more experimentally based. And so these women were active at a time when it was considered appropriate for women to collect wildflowers and press them in their books and things like that. These women took it a lot further than that, though. The first one is Alice Eastwood, who has been written about quite a bit because of her influence through the California Academy of Science in San Francisco. She was born in Toronto, Canada. Again, lost her mother at a young age, was sent to live in a convent, and learned from one of the priests there about gardening, and that really whetted her appetite. Also, love of music, which stayed with her through her whole life. She probably would have pursued that, except her father and brothers had moved to Colorado, and her father sent for her to say, you need to come and keep house for us. And so she did. She became a school teacher in Denver, and of course showed her students the wonders of nature. But at the same time, she spent her summers going all around Colorado collecting plants and learning all she could about the Colorado flora, and became quite an expert at that. And in fact, one story that I love told about being contacted by a prominent British botanist who wanted to come explore mountain flora. And she said, sure, I'll take you some places to see them. And so she packed up her plant press and they were going to go by horse. And so there wasn't much room for anything extra. So in order to have a nightgown along with her, she rolled it up and put it inside her skirt in the back as a bustle. So she packed her nightgown in that way. Very practical. Through her work, and here's a picture of her north of San Francisco. Through her work, she corresponded with another woman who I need to do some exploration on too, Catherine Brandigee, who with her husband were the head of botany department at the California Academy. And she was sending specimens to the herbarium and identifying things. And ultimately in 1892, she was offered a position to come and join the Academy staff. And after a few years, she took over as the head of the Department of Botany. And that's a role she held for 50 years until 1949. She was consumed with her work of building the herbarium. So she collected, she corresponded with people all over the world to trade specimens and build up the herbarium. She also collected books for their library. She gave talks. She established with others a scientific journal. She spent a lot of time with botany clubs, very generous with amateurs who were interested in plants and flowers, which gave her quite a reputation in spite of the fact that she had no higher education, no formal education in botany, but she became very well known because of her many activities. She created a full life in San Francisco, bought a home on Mount Tamalpais, joined an all-men's hiking club, and the men said that it was hard to keep up with her. And she loved going to the opera and cooking for her friends, and became friends with a young Ansel Adams. In her correspondence, she adopted a very deferential tone when corresponding with her male peers, but she could become steely when she knew she was right. And she maintained an extensive correspondence with people all over the country. In 1903, she was listed in the American Men of Science, one of only 2 women. Honorary men, I guess, huh? She's probably best known for her role in after the San Francisco earthquake. After the earthquake damaged heavily, this picture on the right is the in the interior of the Academy building, which used to be on Market Street. Her own home was undamaged by the earthquake, so she immediately went to the Academy, as did a few other people, and they went in and somehow were able to manage to climb up to the 4th floor through the damaged staircase, and she recovered 250 herbarium sheets, which were the type collection for many species. This is the sample by which others are compared to determine is it the same species or not. So very important. And she took them back to her home immediately. But after the earthquake, fires began to move through the city, and she had to move them a couple more times, finally to a home of someone she knew more outside the city. Her home burned. She lost all of her possessions. Her friend Kate Sessions sent her a couple of shirtwaist dresses so she'd have something to wear. About 6 years later, the California Academy of Sciences was rebuilt in its present location in Golden Gate Park, and Alice returned to head the botany department. And it was during this time that she became engaged with the Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden and was on the Board of Advisors, Board of Counselors, as they were called then. She continued her work for many years. She retired at 90, received many awards, and there's a redwood grove named for her up in the Coast Redwood National Park. Another interesting kind of self-taught botanist of this time is a woman named Lester Roundtree, Gertrude Ellen Lester Roundtree. but she preferred to go by Lester. She was a pioneer in the study and protection of California native plants. She popularized native plant horticulture through her numerous writings and public lectures. She propagated native plants and disseminated their seeds throughout the world, and in fact contributed some seeds to Rancho Santa Ana and to other locations. She also led an independent, free-spirited life. She was born in England to Quaker parents who later moved the family to Altadena, to the Quaker colony there. But she went to school in Philadelphia at a Quaker school, graduating in 1902, and she desperately wanted to go to the Pennsylvania Horticulture School for Women, but she needed to come home and care for her ailing mother. She ultimately married and had a son, and the family moved to Carmel, where her brother lived. They had a large house and garden. She got her driver's license, which was a very important step for her, but her marriage ended in divorce in 1931. So broke and homeless at the age of 52, she turned to what she loved, learning about the wild plants throughout California. She would travel about observing, collecting, photographing, and writing about plants in their habitats. And it's wonderful to read a book called Hardy Californians that she wrote. It really is about her explorations, and it's incredible. Where she went, she had a mule for the really tough places that were hard to get to. Otherwise, she outfitted this van kind of car. She took out all the seats and made sort of a jump seat for her to sit in, and all the rest of the space was for her plant presses, tin cans, food cans that she would use to dig up things and bring back to her garden nursery in Carmel. She would usually sleep outside unless it was just really bad weather, but she preferred the outdoors. And apparently she would take a great big jar of olives with her, and that's what she would snack on throughout the day. And November to February, she lived in Carmel. March and April, she went to the desert. May in the foothills, June in the northern counties, and July in higher mountains, August and September in the alpine zone. She financed herself by giving talks, and here's something she was quoted as saying: "I'd wake up on the top of some mountain and remember that I was broke. So I'd have to hike to town, change from gypsy garb to lady clothes, sleeping in a stuffy room overnight, throw a talk, and then get back to my mountains." She ran a seed business with the help of a friend. She was friends with Ansel Adams, Edward Weston, Imogene Cunningham. And in later life, from the late 1950s, she spent her winter months in Joshua Tree National Monument. When she was nearly 100, she had to enter hospice care in Carmel. Her grandson wrote that he thinks she held on until her 100th birthday, knowing, they thought, that she would receive a telegram of congratulations from Queen Elizabeth of England. When it came, she asked that the telegram be read to her twice. After the second reading, her last words were, "There," and she died 5 days later. So quite a character and an explorer. Here's a botanist that takes us back again to the director of the Botanic Garden in 1950, Dr. Catherine Kinsel Muller, who received her BA in botany from UCLA and then her PhD ultimately from University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana in 1937. She met her husband, who was also getting his doctorate in biological sciences, and so their work was often shared together. They would go where one or the other had the work. And he worked with the Bureau of Plant Industry, Department of Agriculture, so they traveled some, but ultimately Catherine got a job at Santa Barbara State College, which became UC Santa Barbara. She went there in 1943 and continued there as a faculty member. And for a short time in 1946, she was a botanist with the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History, but then she joined the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden as an associate in education under someone we've heard of already, Monsell Van Rensselaer. The tenure of Mr. Van Rensselaer during the 1940s was marked by tensions between him and some members of the board, culminating in his departure. A little deja vu here. Catherine Muller was appointed as acting director in October, and within a couple of months, the tenor of the board had changed so dramatically and so positively, they approved her to be the director subsequently by April of 1951. The president of the board, Mr. Bullard, wrote in February 1951, "To me, the most worthwhile lesson over the period is a parody on Kipling. The female is more efficient than the male." And he went on to say, not only Catherine, but the other women involved had really brought the garden forward. And so she had a remarkable 23 years. She oversaw the transformation from a hometown jewel into an international institution. They grew from 50 acres to the present 75. Membership doubled. They built out more. She also advocated publication, a publication program, and she co-authored the Trees of Santa Barbara book and the Wildflowers of Santa Barbara. She was very active in the community as well, and given many awards. People said about her, she had serene but firm leadership. The first word that comes to mind is gracious. Someone said, "Oh, helpful," and she really made a mark on the garden. And her son became the garden's director of research in July 2002. Not sure how long that persisted, but he was also a professor at UC Santa Barbara. So that's another link to our sister garden. Here's one of the few of these women that I actually knew a little bit, a tiny bit. I was very young in graduate school, but Mildred Mathias became a botanist because she couldn't become a math major. She was at Washington University in St. Louis, and the dean of engineering would not let her take a math course in his all-male college that was required for her math major. So she changed to botany and ultimately got her PhD with a study of the carrot family throughout North America. And the interesting story about her youth, in 1929, along with two girlfriends, she drove all over the Western US in a Model T Ford, which she could repair herself. She wanted to visit members of the carrot family in the Western states. And she wrote an article for the St. Louis Globe-Democrat telling about their adventures, which seems pretty adventuresome for 1929. She married and had a family, had 4 children. She did a lot of various research and collecting, usually without pay. But when her husband's job relocated to Southern California in 1944, she linked up with UCLA and became a lecturer and herbarium botanist in 1951. And she was one of the few women faculty at UCLA, ultimately becoming vice chair of the Department of Botany. Mildred's early work, and what I remember most about her during this era of the 60s and 70s, it was when the LA Arboretum was taking shape, and there was a great deal of interest in subtropicals and exotic plants that could be brought to Southern California and thrive in our incredible microclimates. And so she was very much involved in that movement of bringing these plants here, the jacaranda, the coral tree, tababuia, floss silk tree. These were the kinds of plants that were brought then. In 1956, she was appointed director of the UCLA Botanic Garden and served in that role till 1974. And she was the editor of this book, Color for the Landscape. I remember when this came out, and it's full of color photos just extolling the virtue of these incredible flowering trees from around the world. She co-hosted an NBC television show from 1962 to 64 called Wonderful World of Ornamentals. And later in her career, she became very devoted to tropical forests in other parts of the world and led tours to the Galapagos and other places, Costa Rica, to try to preserve what was found in those forests, because we still don't know all the riches that are there. And she was awarded many awards for her contributions, and was very well known, and I heard her speak several times. A contemporary of hers, Elizabeth McClintock, whose sphere was in San Francisco. And so Elizabeth is most associated with Golden Gate Park. She attended UCLA and University of Michigan for her doctoral work. And as a botanist, though, she dedicated herself to the world of horticulture, particularly plant naming. So in the mid-century of the 20th century, when I was in graduate school, she was really one of the authorities on horticultural naming and also identification. So she wrote the book, The Trees of Golden Gate Park. She edited the Journal of the Cal Hort Society, starting in the 1950s, and was one of the founders of Pacific Horticulture in 1976, which continues to be a really high quality publication about Pacific Coast horticulture. She was very involved in preserving natural areas and control of exotic plants. Like her friend Mildred Mathias, and sometimes co-author, she had many recognitions, including being listed in the 1982 listing of American men and women of science. They finally caught up. Sarah Plummer Lemon was from Maine, became an majored in art, but became a self-taught botanist and illustrator. And she was the official artist for the California State Board of Forestry. I saw a little publication she illustrated about pines at the Huntington Library, and it was just exquisite. During the 1890s, she became very active in advocating for the adoption of the golden poppy as a state flower of California, eventually writing the text that was became the bill passed by the legislature and signed in 1903. So I'd say that's a pretty big legacy. I know I'm getting close on time, and I see there is one question. What's your advice? Keep going, or?
I think we can keep going and then take some questions at the end.
Okay, I'm gonna go fast. So, I'm gonna do my professor. I've got a lot to cover. So landscape architects, another group who perhaps by the nature of what they do influence the landscape. First one is Florence Yacht, who was born into a very privileged life in Southern California. She studied at UC Berkeley and at Cornell at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, where she completed a degree in landscape gardening. She began practicing in 1918, and over 53 years, she completed more than 250 projects. She encompassed a broad range of landscape types, from grand estates to campuses and parks, and also got involved in the movie industry, interestingly. So she first worked for a woman in Pasadena named Catherine Bashford, who was a landscape architect. And then she went out on her own and partnered with a woman named Lucille Council. And they lived and worked together for the remainder of their careers until Lucille's death in 1964. Here are three places that exemplify some of Florence's work. The top photo on the right is an estate in Montecito, Il Brolino. And it gives an example of what she was particularly good at, and that's taking the European garden and putting her own spin on it and making it fit into the Southern California locale. She wasn't a copycat, take this and stick it in here. She had very good knowledge of topography and site and surveying, and plants. And so she made it with her own vision, but she developed that style that many of her clients wanted. Below that is a picture, you might recognize this. This is Rancho Los Alamitos. And she was hired to redo the gardens there after an interest in kind of refreshing it and building some expanded nature of the garden. And on the left, I include this only because I talk to people from Cal Poly sometimes. Hard to recognize, but this is the Kellogg Mansion up on the top of Kellogg Hill on the Cal Poly campus. And while she was not the landscape architect, she was brought in to consult on a few things. So that's where that came from. Her estate work attracted the attention of wealthy people in the Los Angeles area. Lower left is a picture of David O. Selznick's home, and she did the garden for his property and for other friends of his. Through that, she became involved with Hollywood films. And so as you see on the top left, picture from Gone with the Wind. And that is Tara, the house, and there's Scarlett coming down the driveway. And this is actually a stage set somewhere in the Los Angeles area. I'm sure that's recorded. I just don't know where it is. She was the one who designed the landscape to look very southern. She spent time in Atlanta and surrounding areas, and then could shape these plants and add flowers even to make them appear to be in that southern environment. Those probably could be coast live oaks there. And, you know, she set them in a way that they look like something you find in Georgia somewhere. On the lower right is from, oh, I just blanked on that, shoot. Not Men to Match My Mountains, was that a movie? Anyway, all of these bulb flowers had to be coming, you know, right at the right time. You can imagine the environmental control they had to do, but that did give her some outlets. The Depression was very difficult for her business. She stayed active with doing a mix of civic and wealthy client work in Pasadena and Santa Barbara. Some of her papers are at the Huntington, and I was reading a notebook she had written, like sort of a diary, and I was so excited I almost stood up and shouted, but you're not supposed to do that there. But she referenced going to see the Hancock Park, which is the park next to the La Brea Tar Pits. She was going to visit there, it was being redone, and she and Mr. Payne were going to go and take a look at it. And it's like, oh my God, that's Theodore Payne. so she definitely was a plants person and a designer, quite interesting. A little more contemporary woman, Ruth Shellhorn, was born and raised in Los Angeles, and she had the good fortune to be a neighbor of Florence Yacht. And so Florence Yacht encouraged her in her interests, but told her it's a lot of hard work. It isn't just for fun. So don't do it just because you think it'll be a lark. Landscape architecture was hard work. So she went to Oregon State and studied landscape architecture. She knew she needed to know more about architecture, so she went to Cornell and got some excellent training there. In 1933, after completing 6 years of school at Cornell, she was 4 units short of her degree. But she couldn't afford the tuition, it was the Depression, for another term. So she asked to double up her course load in her last term so she could finish, but she was refused because the dean felt that women did not have the physical stamina for such an undertaking. So she left without graduating. She began to work back in California and became affiliated with an architect by the name of Wendell Beckett, who was quite known for mid-century modern commercial buildings. And so that is where she really got started, Welton Beckett, I'm sorry. And she did open her own office, and later her husband became her manager, but she did the design. And through Beckett's work, she ultimately got a commission with the Bullock's department store chain. So you might recognize this Bullock's was having the decision was to build 7 suburban shopping centers, and they wanted to make this a shopping experience. It was going to cater to the car driver, bring your car and park, but then come into this place of graciousness and beauty and relaxation with tea rooms and lovely lounge areas. I can remember as a girl when you got dressed up to go shopping at these places, you know, you were going out to a fancy place, and she really had the key to making these beautiful places for women. So she was very successful in this. And you can see some examples of some of the places that she did her work. A lot of subtropicals and things like that. Then in March 1955, Disneyland was almost ready to open. Just prior to the July opening, that's only a few months. And all of the lands were created, but Main Street, the central unifying element, had not been completed. And Walt Disney was asking around, who am I going to get? And Welton Beckett said, here's your person. So he hired Ruth to come and do the design that would sort of pull together the lands and make it a welcoming place and a place for people to gather. And so she did her work, and there's an interesting story about the main square there. And it was getting close to being done, and Walt Disney came along and said, we want a band shell there. There needs to be a band shell. I want that in the middle. And she said, no, I don't think that'll work. And he said, no, that's what I want. So they went ahead and started constructing it. And when it was far enough along, he came to see it, and he said, you're right, get rid of it. And she said, after that, Mr. Disney told me he had absolute confidence in my ability. So, an interesting story. Ruth went on to do design work at UC Riverside and was very active in private gardens and activity in the American Society of Landscape Architects. And here's Beatrix, who we've already talked about a little bit. I won't spend too much time on her, except to say she started her work. She was from a very wealthy family. In fact, her birth family was the Jones family, and they were the family that people wanted to keep up with. That's where that term came from. Her aunt was Edith Wharton. So she moved in very high circles, but her parents divorced when she was young. Her father was a philanderer, so her mother just kicked him out. And so she grew up knowing that she had to find her own way a bit. And she became very independent, and she kind of created her own curriculum to learn. She ultimately worked with Charles Sargent at Arnold Arboretum, someone that Susanna Bixby Bryant conferred with quite a bit about her garden, and traveled to Europe and got a lot of her ideas there. But she really knew plants, she knew topography, she knew surveying, she knew architecture, and she was very successful. Lots of private gardens, including this one in Dumbarton Oaks, where she did an incredible job. And she did campus work at Princeton and Yale. Now, she wasn't a California person, but as you heard, she did come to California at the behest of Mrs. Bliss, who wanted her to work at Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, but also her husband, Max Ferand, was a well-known historian and literary expert, and he was hired by Henry Huntington to be the director of the Huntington Library. And so they came and moved here. In the lower right is a picture of the director's home. I'm not sure what year this was, but she did some design work there. She did some design work at Occidental College, which is on the lower left. And then she also did work at Caltech. And so this courtyard is something that she designed, quite some time ago. Very difficult for her to get her foot in the door in California because she just didn't have the contacts. And she ran up against some a bit of snootiness, and she had to keep reminding people that her professional practice was not as Mrs. Ferand, it was as Beatrix Jones Ferand, that's my name. but they insisted on writing letters to the missus, and so she didn't take it. You know, she said, okay, well, I'm done working here. If I'm not going to get a full commission, I'm not just a volunteer. So so most of her well-known work, of course, is in the East, but I think it's worth mentioning her here. Okay, a few more women. Should I just go through their names quickly? I know I'm over time.
Might as well. I think we're here. Yvonne, what do you think?
Yeah, as long as people want to hang in there, we're fine with it. And it's so exciting. We want to get everything out of Peggy we can.
Well, I'm happy to do it. I love to talk about this stuff. So,
Okay.
Conservation as an area. And this probably fits closest to some of our objectives at our garden, at California Botanic Garden. Although I will say some of these women I've mentioned, Beatrix Ferand did advocate native plants further away from very controlled landscapes around homes, estates. Florence Yacht, when she was working that day, she was going with Mr. Payne to talk about what they were seeing being done at Hancock Park. She was critical of a formal design, and she said, this isn't right. It should be native plants, and it should be a place to bring children to learn about birds and plants and things. Mm-hmm. This was in her writing. So many of these women, while their career focus might not have been on native plants, they did have that sensitivity. But these women were women who focused on California conservation. And one who's kind of fun, I love this description, Ruth Bancroft. This is up in the Walnut Creek area. When Ruth Bancroft was 64 years old, she got down on her hands and knees and etched tiny holes throughout a chunk of her family's land in Walnut Creek. And each went a small cactus, succulent, or other arid climate plant. Right. And so she started later in life, which is very inspiring. And ultimately, the Ruth Bancroft Garden emerged out of that. And just recently, I think this fall, they opened up a brand new visitor center there. I haven't seen it, but I'm excited for them because, that's a tough thing to do during a pandemic, as we all know. But Ruth Bancroft was someone who really loved the arid land plants. They were hard to grow in her climate. It was cold and too wet in times. But she figured out how to mound up soil and bring in good drainage soil and try to make microclimates. And so she was pretty successful for someone who just kind of did it on her hands and knees and with grit. The thing that's compelling about her garden and why I include her in the legacy category is that a man named Frank Cabot, who was an East Coast horticulturalist, came to visit her garden in 1988. And he recognized the reality of the fact that here was a woman who had created this all on her own and was the energy behind it and the financial resource behind it. What was going to happen when she was gone? And so the garden's long-term future concerned him. And out of that inspiration, he helped create the Garden Conservancy, which today, nonprofit, I think it's almost 90 gardens throughout the United States that they work with the owners to create a trust and preserve. And so, so her legacy is nationwide, really, because it was the inspiration of what she created and what could be lost if there wasn't something done to prepare for that. Minerva Hoyt is an interesting woman. Associated in particular with a place you'll recognize in this photo, or this photo of a painting. Minerva was born into an upper class family in Mississippi, married a physician, and they moved to South Pasadena. She was a very wealthy socialite. She was involved with the LA Philharmonic and many other community entities. And then she was also a gardener. She became really enthralled with cactus, and when she traveled to Joshua Tree for the first time, she began to appreciate what was there, and she became alarmed, and this is in the early 1900s. She became alarmed by the increasing ultimately in the teens, automobile traffic going out in the desert, people running over things, people digging up things, particularly in the Palm Springs area. And she just thought that was horrendous. Her husband died in 1918, and so she had the money and the time to devote herself to something, and it became getting public support for preservation of these rare plants and places. So she began exhibiting cacti plants around the country, including at the 1928 American Garden Club show in New York. So she had to get these plants prepared and back there and exhibited. It's hard to believe. She actually took a collection to London. In 1930, she founded the International Desert Conservation League, and their work became to create 3 parks: Joshua Tree, Death Valley, and Anza Borrego. And fortunately, as a woman of means, she had connections and she had ways to get influence. And by 1936, her efforts persuaded President Roosevelt to establish the 80,000-acre Joshua Tree National Monument, which ultimately became a national park. And she even was successful in encouraging Mexico to set aside 10,000 acres for cactus preservation. There's the ability of a woman with some means and some passion and some connections to really make a difference. A more humble story is a woman who also had great influence. Mary de Decker was a woman born in Oklahoma and moved to the San Fernando Valley when she was a young girl. And she loved art and math and science, but she was dissuaded from studying science because it was too hard. But her father taught her to identify plants. And she grew up in Van Nuys, which is where I first lived when I was born, till I was 4, so that's kind of fun connection. She got married in 1929, and her husband, and she went to UCLA and studied art, but due to the Depression, she couldn't continue. Her husband worked for the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, and he got offered the job, which he took, to be transferred to Independence in the Owens Valley in 1935. And when they arrived there, Mary was completely blown over by the beauty, the harsh beauty of the region and the plants. She began studying the plants of the Eastern Sierra. She taught herself how to identify and name them, often corresponding with Philip Munns at Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden. She built up a collection of 6,400 herbarium specimens in her garage. And upon her death, this collection was given to Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden, which of course has our largest native plant collection in the world. Her interests sort of naturally evolved to conservation and preservation. She was active in fighting the opening of the Bureau of Land Management land to unlimited off-road vehicle access. And she was very influential in the fight against water diversion by LADWP on the plant communities in the Owens Valley. And she was instrumental in providing important botanical information during the development of the landmark Inyo County Water Agreement, which in 1973 established environmental laws and provided mitigations for the environmental damage caused by excessive groundwater pumping and surface diversion. She did plant surveys. She wrote the Flora of Northern Mojave Desert in 1984. And today this garden is outside the History Museum in Independence off Highway 395. And this is a garden of natives of the area dedicated to Mary de Decker by the CNPS Inyo chapter. So sort of a lovely place to contemplate the place she came and adopted and became so influential. Her daughters have written a wonderful book about growing up there and what it was like to have a mother who thought nothing of going up in the mountains and collecting plants and camping overnight. And sounds like quite an interesting childhood. I include Alvinia Slauson, who was another kind of society woman who became engaged in the California garden clubs. And in 1931, she became the president of the California chapter of garden clubs, and in 1949, president of the national. And I include her because the garden clubs as a group have been very influential in preservation, including redwood areas and other ones. And and Alvinia's state developed a fund that was based at the University of California for grants for study of plant communities and things of that nature. So while she herself may not have had legacy activities, I think the organization she was devoted to certainly did. And then finally, we'll end with Mary Hunter Austin, who I think was very instrumental in her influence by the fact she wrote a book called Land of Little Rain, The Land of Little Rain. In 1903, she published this. She and her husband had come to the eastern sort of America was. They lived in Carmel part of the time too. They were part of a sort of a literary, she knew Ansel Adams, in fact, co-wrote a book early on with him that had his images in it. But she became very passionate about not only the natural environment, but the native peoples of the inland desert regions of California. And so this book really was the first, of course, of many of environmental writing that woke people up to the idea that there are resources here we don't want to lose. And so that was really very, forward thinking of her. She and her husband both were active in the fight against DWP. They didn't have much success, and he became dispirited and left and moved to Colorado or something. But she persisted. She persisted in her work and her writing. She wrote other books as well. But I'll end with her, a statement that she said. What women have to stand on squarely, not their ability to see the world in the way men see it, but the importance and validity of their seeing it in some other way. And I like to think that these women that I've talked about and many others that I know are out there, and some, many we don't know, nameless women who weren't recorded, have had a major impact on our state and the incredible plant, botanical, horticultural resources that it contains. So that's the end of my comments. I will stop sharing screen and look at some questions.
Yes, let's see. Okay, so everybody, I will go ahead and start with asking the few questions that we already have, but please, if you have any questions, submit them in the Q&A portion. You'll see it along the bottom toolbar. Let's see. So our first question, comments, these women are amazing, first off. In what ways do you think, or what challenges do you think they faced as women in these pursuits?
Yeah, great question. And I didn't have time. I'm doing a lot of writing on these women, so I have time to explore. I try to pay very close attention to what were the challenges and how did they overcome them. And some of them were sort of humorous, the kind of clothes that you wear, or how do I get up to those mountain peaks? And some of Lester Roundtree, I mean, she's talking about, I had to retreat because the lightning was hitting the rock around me up in the high elevations. I decided I better, retreat down lower. And they were courageous. They were not dissuaded easily. Many of them were unnamed, but not all of them. So some of them persisted in spite of having a husband and family. And like for Theodosia Burr Shepherd, her children in particular sort of motivated her. She wanted them to have what she wanted them to have in life. I look occasionally at the theme of having a strong relationship with their fathers. So strong fathers, and I think there's literature on that. Sometimes an absent mother due to death. And I think, you know, and some of them were highly educated and some of them weren't. So what was that piece of them that made them so resilient and so uncompromising of what they wanted to do? That's really what I like to explore. So I keep trying to find more about that. Yeah. Yeah.
Let's see, we have another comment. Thank you for your research efforts and willingness to share. A book on this in the future? Question mark?
As long as future is somewhat elastic, yeah, it's like I keep working on it, so why not? So I definitely am, you're seeing, this is the newest iteration, and I like to set the context with, well, who were the first women? And so I've done a little of that research, and I've got on to some of the Rancho California women, but I can't get to the stuff right now, but there's not too much written. My only disappointment is it's hard to find stuff other than white women. And I'd love to have it a more diverse grouping of women. And there was a woman botanist who collected plants who was of Mexican background, but the legacy piece is what's tricky, you know. What did they leave that we can still see evidence of? So I'm going to have also named section in the back because there's just other names I don't want to drop away. Yep.
Absolutely. Let's see. So another question we have, or maybe a suggestion for the future. Mary Elizabeth Parsons, it sounds like she wrote The Wildflowers of California in 1921. Someone is wondering if we know anything about her.
Right. And Irene has shown me some of her work. It was displayed up in the library for a time, and then she showed me some of the books. Yes, she was a very talented artist who, and actually I read a book about her some time ago. I have to go back and refresh my memory. I think she was in Laguna, is where these paintings were found by somebody up in the attic, you know, the proverbial, we didn't know we had this until we cleaned it out. And so she did a painting in Modjeska Canyon, as I recall, and probably knew Madame Modjeska. So there is that wonderful title, history. Definitely would mention her. I have to explore further what the legacy of these paintings may have done, but yeah, she's on my radar. So thank you for that reminder. Yep.
All right, I guess last chance to submit any questions here. As ask and you shall receive. Curious how many of these women wrote books or have had books written about them.
You know, I was reading a book recently where this was about anthropologists like Margaret Mead and stuff, so totally different topic. But I loved how the author, in the acknowledgments, he thanked the authors who had written about these women. I haven't found too many biographies, but people who wrote about them. And so absolutely, people have written about them, and that's why we have such a rich store of information. Tragically, not all the women out there had much information, like Catherine Muller, boy, the one who was the director at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. I'm sure that they probably have information, maybe her papers, but I'm, probably not able to access them right now. But I really, even just Googling her, I hardly found anything. So some of them it's tough to find, but yes, for many of these, and one of the ones that is most disappointing is nobody wrote about Susanna Bixby Bryant much. We have letters she wrote, letters people wrote to her, as Yvonne well knows, but really, why did she do this? We don't know. We can piece it together because different people said different things, and but we don't really know. So that's the tragedy, that some of these women went unwritten. A number of them were written by their children, which is nice. You have to filter it through, this is my mom and stuff, but also you get very precious observations about them. And we do have The Scent of Lilacs about Susanna Bixby Bryant, which of course is very helpful, but there are some good books, and I can certainly share those. And I'm multitasking, I want to find the name of the book that Mary DeDecker's daughters wrote, because somebody's asking about that. I can read the questions. so I'm going to do that.
I was about to use that as a bridge. Perfect.
Yeah,
Rolling off of that.
It's called, let's see, Sage and Sierra, Growing Up in Owens Valley. And the daughters' names are Carroll Wiens, W-I-E-N-S, and Joan Busby, B-U-S-B-Y. Yeah, it's really a charming book. Yeah. But if anybody's interested in any of the others, there's a wonderful book about Ruth Shellhorn. And the interesting story there is my husband is a retired landscape architecture professor at Cal Poly Pomona. And years ago, he had an assignment in his class. I used to give this kind of assignment too. Go find somebody in your profession and interview them. When you're a student, who wouldn't be saying, oh, you want to talk to me? It's a great way to get entree. So he had a woman in his class, Kelly Comras, who had read about Ruth Shellhorn, called her up and said, hey, can I come interview you? And out of that, a friendship came, advice on what to do with her papers, and ultimately Kelly published a book about Ruth Shellhorn. So I love that story. So anyway.
Let's see, we have another question. Were there any adventurous or dangerous encounters that were tailed? Animals, accidents, illness, men? I know you mentioned the lightning.
Yeah.
Lester's lightning encounter.
Right. Well, definitely Lester Roundtree really pushed the envelope on that stuff. I think, let's see, that's a great question. One I've thought about too much. Probably Alice Eastwood had some adventures as she took herself all over Colorado and California. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah. So I don't know. Maybe it wasn't written about so much, but I'll put that in my filter. Just what I'm looking for when I'm finding out about these women. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, great. I think that wraps it up on my end for the Q&A portion.
There's one more. I see one more about Kate Brandigy. Honeymoon collected San Diego to San Francisco. I haven't really researched her, so I bet there's a lot of good stuff. And I appreciate that being brought up. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank everybody who hung in there. We still have 21 people online, which is great. I know we went up to at least 30. And I know people have to have other appointments. So I want to remind everybody, this is recorded. It's going to be on the CalBG website, which is great, so everybody can read it or listen to it again. And I want to remind everybody that we do have another enrichment coming up on February the 22nd. Rachel Patos, our archivist in the library, is going to be talking about the art of archiving and the CalBG library collection. So I hope everybody can join again with that and learn some more about our resources. So thank you all for coming.
Bye-bye.